Thanks. And I really want to thank the organizers of this Earth Optimism Summit, which has really been very inspiring, and it's been a wonderful event, and I'm glad to be a part of it. Wow, happy Earth Day. I also went out on the mall today, and my feet are still soaking wet. And I really want to express my admiration for all the people who showed up to support science and environmentalism. The people who got soaking wet doing it here, but also the millions of people who came out in cities all around the world, not just in the United States. It's really an amazing outpouring, and it's bigger than just a protest against this current administration. It's really the greatest outreach I've ever seen to interest young people in science and just encourage people to listen to science in general. And my highlight of the afternoon was seeing a young girl who had a sign that said, "Rising oceans, Mar-a-Lagoon." It was very good. So I'm going to, in the spirit of this conference, I'm going to give you a highly speculative talk and talk more about the future than about the past. And what I want to do is talk about what we just heard a mention of is how important plants have been as sources of medicines and how potentially important they could continue to be in the future, which is one of the sort of most capitalist reasons for conserving them. Historically, plants have always been one of our major sources of therapeutic treatments for health conditions. And if we do a little bit of math, we can actually make some pretty interesting speculations about how many drugs may remain undiscovered in nature. So the first data point that you need to know is you need to have some sort of an estimate of how many of our drugs come from nature. Well, the most conservative one is that Norman Farnsworth, the great pharmacognosist from the University of Illinois, identified 119 drugs as coming from natural sources in 1990. And since that time, there have been about a dozen and a half more licensed from plants. Now, this is the most conservative look that you could take because these are all compounds that either exist as we use them as medicines in plants or they're synthetically produced copies of plants. This does not include drugs that are developed because we found an interesting bioactive and we started tinkering with its chemical structure and we ended up with a useful pharmaceutical. Like many of our common anti-malarial drugs now, they look like quinine, but they're chemically different. So they're not in this figure. I'm going to use 135 as the number of drugs that have come from plants. The second piece of information we need is we need an estimate of how many species of plants there are. And in 1973, the great evolutionary biologist Ledyard Stebbins tried to count them all, and he came up with a figure just a little over 230,000. And since that time, there have been numerous papers published speculating about how many species of plants there are. And those numbers range all the way from the low 300,000s to almost 500,000. But how many really are out there? There's more than one component to the question. First of all, there is the question of how many plant species do we already know? And a lot of the papers that have been published and account for the wide range of variation have been trying to accommodate or deal with the fact that we botanists are very good at redundantly naming things. So there are certainly a lot more names. There's about 1.2 million published names for plants, and there clearly are nowhere near that many plant species. So there have been many estimates to try to figure out what percentage of those names really are synonyms, and then do math to figure out how many plant species we accept. I actually think that Stebbins' approach gives you a more accurate answer. And if you do that and you ask and you use something like David Mabberley's plant book and you go through and add up the numbers that were provided by specialists for each known family of vascular plants, you get a number that's very close to 300,000. And so I'm going to use that as the number of plants that are known. This is Catharanthus micaensis. It's an interesting member of a genus. One of its congeners gives us vincristine, a chemical that's used to treat childhood leukemia. This is a species that one of our scientists at the garden described as new to science last year. There's also the question of how many plants are out there that remain to be named, the Donald Rumsfeld unknown unknowns. And that is a much more difficult problem to grapple with. The one thing that we can quantify is that the botanical research community as a whole publishes on average about 2,000 new species of plants every year and has continued to do so for the last 40 or 50 years, and that number goes up and down a few hundred each year, but it doesn't fluctuate much and the average stays about the same. We don't see any asymptote coming. And when I talk to most of my colleagues who are systematists, most of them have cabinets full of stuff that they're waiting to describe. I think the 2,000 may be more a measure of how much available journal space there is rather than how many plants actually remain to be described. But I'm going to assume that over the next 50 years, botanists will describe another 100,000 species. The last thing that we need to know, if there's 300,000 known species and 100,000 unknown, so we have 400,000 total. The hardest number to figure out is what percentage of the plant world was studied to find the 135 known plant-derived medicines. And the literature is full of estimates that say everything from we've studied 2% of the world's plants or we've only studied 15% of the world's plants. But when you look at those, you quickly realize that those are very misleading numbers because you don't need to understand this list. What you need to realize is that each one of the things in this list is a therapeutic category. It's not a disease. So cancer is in that list once, although the United States National Cancer Institute recognizes more than 300 different kinds of cancers. Bacterial diseases are in that list once. The bottom line is some plants have been evaluated against a few, usually a small number of therapeutic targets. I think there's very few plants that we can cross off the list as of no utility for anything. Certainly we can cross off our major food plants, something like corn that's been picked apart one molecule at a time. I don't think anybody thinks they're undiscovered drugs in our major starch crops. But another element of this is that in the way that these plants that have historically been evaluated, even in the 1960s, Matt Suffness, who ran the Natural Products Discovery Program at the National Cancer Institute at the time, pointed out that the way we screen and evaluate plants, you're only likely to find those active compounds that are present at highest concentration in the plant. People have been studying crude extracts that are mixtures of 400 to 700 chemicals, and you've got to either be extremely potent or extremely abundant to be able to be discovered with that kind of a discovery mentality. So what have we learned? Well, we've learned that there probably are a lot more plants out there than we've historically thought, and we've learned that we probably have not evaluated very many of them thoroughly. We haven't studied them well at all. And we probably haven't even done a good job evaluating the ones that we have evaluated. I'm absolutely certain that of the discovery programs that I've been involved with, that there have been many plants that went through batteries of bioassays that had use, and those samples had useful compounds in them that were not discovered. So knowing these figures, or having an upper and a lower bound for these figures, we can do some calculations. So we're assuming that there's 135 known plant-derived drugs, that there's 300,000 to 400,000 plant species out there, and depending upon what kind of assumptions you make and where you fall on the spectrum, I'm going to say that somewhere between 5,000 and 50,000 plants have been evaluated. So from that, it's pretty easy to just plug those into a formula and come up with an estimated number of potential drugs that remain in nature to be discovered. And so if you have 300,000 and 400,000, and then you look at what happens if you screened 5,000 to 50,000. These are the, whoa, that's not what I expected. These are the numbers of predicted drugs that are out there in nature to be discovered. The low end of the spectrum being that you assume you've screened a lot, and you assume that we're only going to count the species that we already know. And the high end here being that you assume that there are still 100,000 species out there that we haven't found yet, and that we really haven't screened very many at all. The bottom line is all of these numbers dwarf the 135 that are in our current pharmacopoeia. So even the most current estimates, even the most conservative estimates, show that we really haven't found most of what is probably already out there. So in conclusion, I think we can say that there are probably a myriad of pharmacologically useful compounds that remain in nature, that remain undiscovered, but they're probably very unevenly distributed, and we're going to have to look for them differently than we've historically looked for them in the past. I think probably lots more plants have made it into discovery laboratories, and they actually had useful compounds in them, and they weren't discovered. So I think this is one of the great arguments for conserving plants. These intact forests are, in fact, reservoirs of pharmaceutically useful compounds, and we've barely scratched the surface. Thanks.
One or two questions for Jim, if they're brief. Use the mic, please, because we're video streaming all this, and it's going all over the world.
Well, that's a scary thought. So I have a question about that is, so you're saying there's all these plants that may have these like bioactive compounds and things, but usually when you do drug discovery, you find a symptom or a problem, and then you try to solve it from there. So I don't really understand. Like, you're saying that in vivo screens are taking too long, or too tedious to go through, and like, for example, if you're doing an antiviral drug, you're gonna do like a high throughput screen with like robots and thousands of samples a day, and I'm just wondering how, like, what's the Are you looking for biologically active compounds and then trying to find a use for them, or is it the other way around?
No, all of the discovery programs that I'm talking about. There are multiple approaches to finding new therapeutic compounds, but one of them is screening, and screening is driven by bioassays that are target specific. So we don't isolate a compound and then ask what it might be used for. We find it because it was active in an antiviral assay. And almost all of those assays these days are robot driven, and they're very high throughput.
Thank you.